Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight we find ourselves face to face with things that should have stayed buried. Some deaths don't take, some memories don't fade, and sometimes the very soil under your feet remembers more than you want it to. Joining me tonight, steady as ever and just as prone to picking at scabs, is my co-host, the voice that crackles like a storm-fed wire, Mr. Malcolm Blackwood.
Thanks, Otis. You know, they say time heals all wounds. But that's assuming the wound doesn't get up and start walking around. Tonight's tales peel back the layers on things we thought were over and shows us what happens when death, decay, or justice refuse to lie still.
So grab your gloves and light the lantern, friend, because what we're digging up tonight, it was meant to die. Before we follow the sound of breathing beneath the floorboards, a little invitation. If you like your nightmares uninterrupted and your horror uncut,
then consider supporting us by joining the patrons area. For just $7.99 a month or less with a yearly plan, you'll get early access to each new episode, ad-free listening, and bonus tales too haunting for daylight hours.
Visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons. That'll take you to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where the fire never burns out and the stories are always hungry.
Support indie horror, fuel the fright, and remember, the scariest things don't knock, they let themselves in.
Now then, let's take a walk through the wetland and see what's waiting beneath the reeds, shall we? Our first tale tonight takes us into the fog-drenched outskirts of a quiet town where something unnatural is gestating beneath the schoolyard, and the truth is slick, scaled, and unspeakably old. This is Barrel Babies by Devon Kess, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Darla Wynne noticed at first in the kindergarten nurse logs. She'd worked in the school system for 14 years, long enough to understand the rhythms of childhood illnesses and the minor oddities that occasionally come with growth. Warts, rashes, learning difficulties. Sometimes a child would faint during gym or complain about something no one could quite pin down. Parents came in worried, teachers whispered diagnoses they were not qualified to give, and the school would return to normal by the end of the week. But something changed that year. The new students were different, not in their personalities or behavior, but in ways that clung to biology. She kept finding anomalies during routine screenings and minor injuries. An extra digit hidden beneath an underdeveloped nub on the foot. A child with soft webbing between her fingers, like something halfway formed then halted. There were missing fingernails on infants with pristine hygiene records. And just yesterday, she tended to a boy with 2 sets of molars in his lower jaw, none of which had erupted until he was 5. Darla had quietly started a file. She used her own stationery, made careful notes by hand, and kept the folder in her locked desk drawer, never entering the information into the district system. There were now 7 children in her log. All were in early childhood programs. All had been born within a 10-mile radius of Grainer Holler Elementary, and none of their parents seemed particularly surprised when she mentioned the defects. Some didn't respond at all. Others became defensive the moment Darla brought up prenatal care or birth complications. The boy with the second row of teeth had a mother who bristled at her questions and asked flatly if Darla had a medical license. The girl with the webbing had a father who insisted she had been born in Milwaukee, even though Darla had seen the Granger County Hospital bracelet on the child's arm the previous week, still half tangled in the threads of her jacket sleeve. Darla had tried bringing it up, gently, cautiously, to Principal Clay. He'd smiled in that tired managerial way that suggested he didn't want to deal with her, but also did not want to appear negligent. Oh, these things come in waves, he said as he poured his coffee. You'll find a cluster of asthma, a bunch of speech delays, a group of kids with flat feet. Patterns always emerge when you're looking too hard, but they usually don't mean much. She'd wanted to argue, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she kept looking. The dreams had returned, too. They always came in fall when the mornings began with crust, frost, and the wetlands filled with fog so dense it muffled the sound of birds. In those dreams, she stood on the bank behind the school, staring into the cattails, waiting for something to rise. Sometimes she heard crying, but she couldn't find its source. Other times, there was just the soft sloshing sound of something substantial moving beneath the surface. Last night it had been different. She had seen her daughter again. Nora had been dead for 9 years, stillborn, a silent delivery in a darkened room. The doctor had not let Darla hold her at first. They had wrapped her too quickly, as though contact might damage them both. But in the dream, Nora had moved. Her skin had been pale and smooth, her eyes slightly too wide, and her mouth opened as if trying to form a word. She had looked up from the reeds behind the school and said, "It's under us." Darla had woken with her hands clenched against her chest and her nails digging into her skin beneath her collarbone. She had not cried. Instead, she had dressed early and walked to the school before sunrise, cutting behind the parking lot and pushing through the tree line that separated the playground from the marsh. The path was overgrown but still visible. Children used to come this way when they wanted to sneak a smoke or carve things into trees. Now, with the new fence and security cameras, it had mostly gone untouched. She stepped carefully, listening to a squelch of her boots in the wet grass and the soft rustle of cattails overhead. A layer of mist hung just above the marsh, shimmering faintly in the morning light. Then she heard a distant sound, muffled by the reeds and filtered through waterlogged earth. It was not a frog or a bird or even the wind. Rather, it was rhythmic and hollow, as if something were breathing inside metal. She followed the sound until she found a storm drain, nearly hidden beneath a collapsed wooden fence. The grate had rusted through at one corner, creating an opening large enough for something small, or something that used to be small, to squeeze through. The air around it smelled wrong. Not just like decay or algae, but akin to the metallic bite of blood, mixed with something sweeter, rot and sugar. The kind of smell she'd first noticed in the living room just before they told her Nora had never taken a breath. Darla crouched by the drain and placed one hand against the wet concrete. It vibrated faintly. Whatever sound had been moving through the pipe was gone now, but she could still feel the residue of its rhythm. Something had been moving in there, something that had lungs, or gills. She stood slowly, brushing dew from her knees, and looked out toward the rest of the marsh. The trees stood still, no birds moved through the branches. From somewhere deeper in the reeds, a sound echoed back to her. It was faint, but unmistakable. A child's voice, calling her name. Mommy? Darla did not run. She walked back to the school with measured steps, memorizing the route, the landmarks, and the distance between the rusted grate and the edge of the playground. Once inside, she washed her hands, changed her clothes, and placed a fresh page in the log folder in her drawer. This time, she didn't write down a name. She wrote, possible connection between drainage infrastructure and marsh proximity. Recommend environmental survey. Drain near east boundary vibrates. Strong scent. Voice heard. Then, beneath that, in smaller letters, dreamed of Nora again. She's closer. She closed the folder, locked the drawer, and turned as the first bell rang. Children began to stream past her office, laughing and shrieking as they always did. A little boy limped by, his sock soaked with blood from a cut on his foot. His teacher called to him and scolded him gently for running. He looked up at Darla and smiled. For a moment his eyes glinted, too round, too wide, almost translucent. Then he blinked and they looked normal again. Darla stepped back into her office and shut the door behind her. She did not sit down. She simply stood there, her hand shaking, trying to remember if she had ever looked closely enough at Nora's eyes when she was born, and if they had even closed. Part 2. 2 days passed without incident, though Darla remained hyper-aware of the children in the halls. Every irregular movement caught her eye, every cough seemed deeper than it should have been, and every unusual skin tone appeared more unnatural. Her inner rational voice tried to convince her that stress had begun to distort her perception, but when she looked again at her private log, the dates and entries hadn't changed. There were 9 children listed now. One had been added just that morning, a girl named Kata, whose mother had brought her in for a scraped chin. Darla gently lifted the child's sleeve to examine for swelling, only to find the girl's upper arm covered in small, raised nodules beneath the skin. They were too symmetrical, too ordered to be a natural rash. They reminded Darla of fish eggs. The mother said they had appeared 3 months ago, and that the pediatrician had called it subcutaneous calcium pockets. She didn't elaborate further and seemed irritated by Darla's interest. That night, Darla returned to the path behind the school. The sky had turned overcast, and the marsh was darker than it had been during her first visit. She brought a flashlight, although the beam barely cut through the mist. The reeds remained shoulder-high, swaying despite the stillness of the air. She could hear the soft crackling of insects, but no birds and no frogs. She reached the collapsed fence and crouched beside the storm drain. The rusted gate had not moved since she last saw it, but the mud around it bore strange indentations. They were not boot prints and did not belong to any animal she could easily identify. The closest comparison that came to mind was the soft, rounded edges of an infant's foot, though larger and stretched oddly wide. She leaned closer and angled her flashlight down into the tunnel. The beam struck a curved surface below, something metallic and slick. It reflected the light in faint, dappled patterns like oil in water. A thin sheen coated the interior of the drain, and where it pooled near the opening, it emitted a smell even stronger than before. This time, it made her gag. She forced herself to remain steady, bracing one hand against the concrete as she steadied the flashlight. Deep inside the tunnel, far beyond the reach of the beam, she caught movement. It was not rapid or jerking, but slow and serpentine. Something shifted behind the fluid, stirring sediment that drifted upward like ash. Then the sound returned. A deep, slow thudding. Not quite like breathing, nor mechanical. It echoed softly through the tunnel, building into a slow rhythm that pulsed against the fingers as they touched the wall. She pulled back and sat on the edge of the collapsed fence, trying to regulate the panic building in her chest. The smell clung to her skin. The sound stayed in her ears. She didn't know how long she sat there before she realized something had been left behind. A manila envelope leaned against the broken chain-link fence. It was damp. The corners curled from moisture, but it had not been there earlier. Darla scanned the area and saw no movement in the reeds or along the trail behind her. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside were photos, medical scans, thermal images, black and white snapshots of what looked like fetal deformities in various stages of gestation. One image showed a child's open mouth. The teeth inside did not resemble human dentition at all. They were conical and backward curved, bearing a resemblance to those of a lamprey. Beneath the photos, she found a folded sheet of paper. The ink had bled slightly from exposure, but the message remained legible. They knew. The dump sites were never sealed. The marsh is still absorbing. The soil isn't dead, it's gestating. At the bottom of the note, in a different ink and shakier hand, were the initials RC. Darla returned home in a daze and locked the envelope in her filing cabinet beneath her log. She sat awake for hours, reviewing the photos by lamplight until the dream took her again. In this one, Nora was waiting at the edge of the marsh. Her skin was no longer smooth, but dappled with pale, translucent spots. Her limbs were longer, her fingers spread wider apart. When she turned to speak, her voice came from somewhere behind her face, as if her mouth were only a suggestion. She said, "You forgot where they took me. You let them take the pieces." Then she smiled, and Darla saw the same conical teeth. The next morning, Darla called the number printed in tiny type at the bottom of one of the thermal scans. It had been labeled as a sample from 1996 and included the source, Dr. Raymond Crest, environmental toxicology consultant. The number rang 3 times before a man answered. He didn't speak, he simply waited. "Dr. Crest?" she asked. No response came. My name is Darla Wynne," she continued. "I'm a nurse at Grainer Hollow Elementary. I received something yesterday. Photos with your name on them. I think you've been watching what's happening out here for longer than I've been alive." The man did not answer, but he heard a faint rustle, like someone shifting paper near the receiver. "I want you to know what's happening. I think you do, too. Please, just let me ask you some questions. I'll come to you. Just tell me where." The line disconnected. She stared at the phone for several seconds before it rang again. This time, it displayed no caller ID. She answered immediately. The voice that spoke was dry and thin. "If you come here, do not touch anything." I won't," she said. "Where are you?" "I'm where they dumped it," he said. "Bring gloves." The call ended. That evening, Darla followed the directions Crest had left on her voicemail. The house he lived in was barely that, a small, dented trailer parked half a mile from the edge of the marsh, its aluminum siding stained with black streaks. The surrounding land had sunken unevenly, and the tires supporting the trailer had vanished into soft ground. Tall reeds clustered around the steps, and the porch light blinked at irregular intervals. She knocked twice. When no one answered, she stepped back and waited. After nearly a minute, the door opened a few inches. A pale, watery eye looked out through the gap. "Do you live alone?" she asked. "Not entirely," the man replied. He opened the door wide enough to let her in. The air inside smelled of mildew and something else. Ammonia, maybe, or formaldehyde. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and sealed crates. A central table held a microscope, several cracked petri dishes, and a wide glass container filled with liquid. Suspended inside it was a creature scarcely the size of a fist. Its body was shaped like a frog, but its limbs ended in what appeared to be tiny human fingers. Its mouth had no jaw, just a round, gaping orifice, rimmed with nodules that quivered faintly. Crest did not sit. He leaned against the counter and watched her without blinking. "They said the water was clean by 84, he muttered. EPA came out, ran tests, and declared the runoff within acceptable thresholds. But they only tested surface samples. They never cored the basin, never looked underneath." He pulled a file from the cabinet beside him and handed it to her. Photographs inside showed satellite images of the marsh over 3 decades. In each image, the terrain shifted subtly. New shapes emerged in the water. The most recent photo was marked in red, circling an area that resembled a swollen vein branching off a central point near the old waste facility. "It's growing," he said. "It doesn't die, doesn't even age. It divides, fuses, crossbreeds." "With what?" she asked. Crest stared at her for a long moment. "With us," he said. "Or at least it tries to. It's been attempting replication since the early 80s. It learned what a host looks like, but not what makes one viable." He turned away from her and opened a second crate. Inside were more samples, some tissue, some bone, and one sealed jar containing a fetus no larger than an orange. Its skin was translucent. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth had no lips. It appeared to be smiling. "They didn't just dump chemicals," Crest said. "They dumped genetic modifiers, runoff from experimental growth agents, and hormone disruptors. The company didn't know what the half of it would do, and they didn't care. All they needed was for it to sink." Darla felt her hands tighten around the file folder. "This thing," she said, "it's still alive down there." He nodded once. "I believe it's building something. Kind of something. I think it's building a body," he said. "One piece at a time." Part 3. The rain began as Darla left Crest's trailer. It came in a steady, unscented sheet, falling without thunder and barely rustling the reeds. The sky remained a pale, unbroken gray with no visible movement in the clouds. She drove in silence, her windshield wipers scraping against glass slick with marsh pollen and road dust. Crest's words repeated themselves in her mind like scripture from the text of a religion she never subscribed to. It's building a body. That idea would not leave her. Not even as she pulled into her driveway, not as she stripped off her shoes and left them by the door, not as she stood in the shower for 20 minutes, letting the hot water scald the back of her neck. She opened her locked drawer and pulled out the folder. She laid each page out across the dining room table, aligning the thermal scans beside the hospital records, the notes beneath the photographs, and the final report from the old Grainer Fertility Center, now permanently closed. Every document pointed back to the marsh. Every outlier curved toward something underneath. When she finally slept, it was shallow and restless. Her dreams came in fits. Nora appeared again, standing beneath a storm drain, her face partially submerged in black water. Her mouth moved, and although no sound emerged, Darla understood every word. "You left me there. I waited, but you left me." She woke with her fists clenched so tightly that her fingernails had left crescent-shaped wounds on her palms. She called in sick the following morning and returned to the school just before dawn, parking her car several blocks away. She walked the rest of the distance along the edge of the fence, cutting across the east yard, until she reached the far drainage corridor. The grate still sat half submerged in moss and rust. The marsh beyond it buzzed faintly in the mist. This time she came prepared. She wore rubber boots, gloves, and a padded jacket, and had brought a small flashlight and a breathing mask from the emergency kit in her trunk. The drain led to an old utility tunnel that extended beneath the school property. No one had used it for decades. The district had once planned to repurpose it for geothermal upgrades, but the funding had evaporated after a failed bond vote. She moved carefully into the mouth of the tunnel, crouching low to avoid the jagged metal teeth of the broken grate. The concrete interior curved downward, the surface slick with algae and dark runoff. Her boots squelched with each step. The air grew colder the farther she went. After 20 feet, the tunnel widened into a small maintenance corridor. Exposed rebar jutted from the walls, and rivulets of moisture traced paths down into the sloping floor where it pooled into a narrow channel that continued deeper underground. The smell grew stronger with each step. It was chemical at first, metallic and acrid, but soon became something else entirely. Beneath the surface scent was a kind of sweetness that stuck in the back of her throat and made her teeth ache. It was the scent of decay, but not of rot. It was the scent of something transforming. A single pipe jutted up from the wall ahead. It had been broken off years ago and now served as an impromptu shelf for debris carried in by runoff. Scraps of plastic, tangled weeds, the husk of what had once been a raccoon, now bloated and hollowed from within. She stepped past it, following the slight curve of the corridor. Her flashlight began to flicker, its batteries drained faster than expected. She tapped it gently and pressed on. After another 15 feet, she saw the door. It had been painted green once, but the color had long since peeled away. Rust coated the hinges, and the lock had broken under pressure from the shifting concrete around it. The door hung crooked in its frame, leaving a gap wide enough to shine her light through. Inside, the room sloped downward and widened into a chamber she hadn't known existed. The walls were lined with large metal barrels, many of them ruptured or partially sunk into the surrounding earth. The floor had once been concrete, but now it appeared soft and uneven, covered in a thick mat of black moss or algae that seemed to respond when she stepped on it. Several shapes were scattered across the far wall. At first, she thought they were industrial debris, sections of pipe or insulation, but as she approached, she realized they were bones. Small ones, infant-sized. Some were clean and white, picked dry by time. Others retained fragments of tissue or cloth. One still wore a plastic hospital bracelet. She leaned closer and brought her flashlight to bear. The lettering had mostly faded, but a few letters remained. The last name was still legible. Wynn. Her knees weakened. She steadied herself against the wall. She had not told anyone. The hospital had used her last name on the records. She had not shared that detail with Crest. No one else should have known. She took a step back, but her boot slipped slightly on the pulsing moss. When she looked down, she realized it wasn't moss at all. It was a network of gelatinous tissue, translucent and vascular, like the lining of a womb. She staggered away from the wall and turned to leave. The flashlight flickered again and died. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Then, from somewhere within the chamber, a wet, sloshing sound began. It came from deep within the structure, each movement accompanied by a soft suction. It came from deep within the structure, each movement accompanied by a soft suction, as if whatever was rising was separating itself from a surface it had adhered to. She could hear breathing, but it wasn't hers. It was rhythmic, too slow to belong to a mammal, and punctuated by small, gurgling gasps, like fluid being sucked through a narrow channel. Something moved near the barrels. She could hear the sound of skin brushing metal. She reached into her coat for the backup pen light and switched it on. The beam was weak, but enough to see the floor. A new trail had formed behind her. It was viscous and glistening, as if something had crawled across the membrane, dragging weight behind it. Then a voice echoed from the far end of the room. It was small. It was unmistakable. "Mommy." Darla's breath caught in her throat. "Come see me." She aimed the light toward the voice. At first she saw nothing, just the barrels. Then something shifted between them. Something small curled against the floor. It was shaped like a child, but with limbs too long and thin, as if someone had stretched the proportions of an infant across a marionette. Its skin gleamed with translucent patches, its mouth twitching erratically. The eyes opened. They were Nora's. "Why did you leave me?" it asked. Darla took a step back. Her boots sank halfway into the membrane. She yanked it free and began backing toward the corridor. Behind her, something groaned. The wall bulged inward, distorting with pressure. The membrane stretched and began to split. A fluid hissed from the opening, and several of the barrels collapsed inward, crushed by the weight of something moving beneath the chamber floor. The child thing between the barrels began to laugh. It was a quiet, wet sound, unformed and gurgling. Darla turned and ran. The corridor closed in around her as she retraced her steps, the sound of her boots echoing in the confined space. Behind her, the laughter grew louder, mixing with the slosh of something far too large trying to follow. She reached the grate and clambered through, scraping her back on the rusted metal as she emerged into the marsh. She kept moving, crashing through reeds and wet grass until she reached the far end of the schoolyard. Only then did she stop to breathe. The sky above remained unchanged, gray, motionless. Somewhere behind her, the marsh had gone silent again. She walked home in a fog. Her boots left black streaks on the sidewalk. She did not stop to clean them. She stepped into her house, locked the door behind her, and sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the file again. She took the old ultrasound photo from its plastic sleeve and turned it over. There, scrawled in red ink, was something she'd not noticed before. No heartbeat, no movement, no breath. Beneath it, in a different hand, still developing. Part 4. Darla called the school the next morning and reported that she would be out again. Her voice remained calm even as she stared at the mud-streaked boots by the door, and the faint handprint still visible on the back of her jacket, one she could not recall receiving. She spent the early hours disinfecting everything she'd carried with her into the drain tunnel. The mask, gloves, and penlight went into a sealed trash bag. She triple-wrapped the boots and set them in the outdoor bin. Then she scrubbed her hands until her knuckles bled. She returned to the dining room table and reviewed everything again. There'd been no camera down there, no witness, no record, aside from the things she'd carried in and out of that chamber. Even a hospital bracelet she had tried to retrieve from the infant remains, had disintegrated in her hand. Her only proof now lived in the pages of her notes, the photographs from Crest, and the sound that still echoed faintly in her ears when the house fell silent. She knew that if she remained quiet, if she said nothing, if she filed the experience away as trauma or hallucination, she could resume her job without consequence. She could ignore the bruises on her shin, the tremor in her right hand, and the knowledge that whatever lay beneath the school had whispered in her daughter's voice. But she also knew she couldn't live with that choice. At 10 a.m., she drove to the school and asked to see Principal Clay. He met her in the front office with his usual strained smile, glancing briefly at the secretary before ushering her into his office and closing the door. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You've been out for a few days. Staff's been wondering." "I'm not here about myself," Darla said. I'm here about the students, the things I've been documenting. Clay's expression did not change, but a slight tightness entered his posture. He folded his hands on his desk and leaned back. Darla, I know you care about the kids, he said. You've always been thorough, but you've also been under a lot of stress. This isn't about stress, she said. This is about something living beneath the school. It's affecting the children. It's affecting pregnancies in town. I have proof. She placed a copy of her notes on his desk, along with one of the photographs from Crest's envelope. The image showed a malformed fetus with webbed limbs and translucent skin suspended in fluid. Clay didn't touch it. He stared at the photograph, then slowly slid it back toward her. You can't show this to people, he said. You can't go around telling parents their kids are infected or defective. Do you understand the panic that would cause? The lawsuits? I'm not speculating. I've seen where it's coming from. The drainage system. Behind the east fence leads to a buried chamber. There are remains down there. Bones. Infant bones. Clay stood and moved to the door. I think you should go home, he said. Take some more time off. I'll arrange for a substitute nurse for the rest of the week. You're not listening. No, he said, I'm not. Because this isn't the first time I've heard this kind of hysteria. You're not the only one who's come forward over the years, but every time someone makes these kind of claims, they wind up walking them back, once they realize how little they actually know about what goes on around here. Darla stood as well. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. You knew, she said. Maybe not all of it, maybe not what it would have become, but you knew something was wrong with that land, and you still built a playground next to it. Clay didn't respond. He opened the door and waited for her to leave. She walked past him without another word. That evening, she tried calling Crest. The line rang until it cut to static. She tried again an hour later. This time it went straight to voicemail. She drove back to his trailer just before dusk. The door was open. The sheriff's cruiser idled in tall grass out front. Two men in uniform stood near the porch, speaking quietly to a third man in plain clothes. Smoke drifted from the interior of the trailer, thin and bitter. One of the officers turned as she approached. "And you, Dr. Crest," she said. "Is he all right?" The officer frowned. "There was a fire," he said. "Short-circuited equipment. Electrical fault, most likely. He was inside. Didn't make it." Darla stared past him into the trailer. The walls were scorched black and the ceiling had partially collapsed. Everything inside appeared melted or charred beyond recognition, except for a single file cabinet, which stood mostly intact near the rear corner. She saw a plain envelope on top, its corners curling from heat. "Did you have any next of kin?" she asked. The officer shook his head. "No family that we know of," he said. "Lived off the grid. Strange guy, but harmless." Darla nodded and stepped back. She waited until the officers had moved toward the cruiser before turning away and walking back to her car. That night, she visited the old Granger County Birth Records office. The building had not been updated since the mid-1980s, and most of the archives were still stored on paper. The clerk on duty, an elderly woman with tremors in both hands, barely looked up as Darla signed in. "I'm looking for stillbirth records between 1985 and 2000, Darla said, specifically within the school district boundary. The woman raised an eyebrow. "You'll be lucky to find anything," she said. "Most of the older files got pulled during the last audit. Some were destroyed. HIPAA stuff, privacy compliance." "Were any of them flagged as medical anomalies?" Darla asked. The clerk hesitated. "There was a cluster back in '89, 4 stillbirths in 2 weeks, all delivered at Grainer General. But that hospital burned down in '94, so the files are mostly gone. Why are you asking?" "I'm a nurse at the elementary school," Darla said. "I'm seeing patterns, and I think they started decades ago." The woman tapped her pen against the counter. "You're not the first to notice," she said. Darla looked up sharply. "Who else?" she asked. "Parents, a few doctors. One OB-GYN left town without explanation. Said the air wasn't right. That was back in 91. Do you remember the name?" The clerk nodded. "Dr. Sagan, Olivia Sagan. Moved to Michigan, I think. Claimed she was sick. But some of us think she knew something and got out before it got worse." "Did she leave any notes?" "If she did, they didn't survive the fire," the clerk said. "Or they were taken before it." Darla left the building with a photocopy of a birth certificate belonging to one of the infants from the 1989 cluster. The child had been unnamed. The certificate bore a red stamp marked non-viable. Under cause of death, it simply said, "Unknown systemic failure." She stopped by her house just long enough to grab her flashlight and a new mask. Then she returned to the marsh. The night air carried a low hum, and the reeds rustled without wind. She approached the rusted utility building she'd first discovered beyond the East Trail. The fence surrounding it had collapsed entirely. The door hung open now, as if waiting. She stepped inside. The interior smelled of mold and oil. The walls were lined with pipes and rusted electrical panels. Several barrels sat in the far corner, corroded and partially sunk into the floor. Labels had peeled away or dissolved entirely, leaving only faint impressions. Darla approached one of the barrels and pressed her gloved hand to the metal. It felt warm. She looked down and saw the same gelatinous membrane she'd found beneath the school, stretched thin across the floor. On the wall above the barrels, someone had tacked photographs and notes. They were water-damaged and curling, but still legible. One photo showed a newborn with fused eyelids and a split palate. Another displayed a thermal scan of subterranean cavity, one that glowed with heat and movement. In the center of the board, a newspaper clipping had been pinned. The headline read, "Young Brahm spearheads flood recovery project." The article featured a photo of a man in his 20s, Harold Brahm, now Councilman Brahm, shaking hands with contractors in front of a pile of industrial waste barrels. In the background, men and waiters stood knee-deep in marsh water, stacking barrels behind a temporary barrier. Darla stepped back and looked around the room. The pipes overhead creaked softly. A drop of moisture struck her on her shoulder. The floor vibrated beneath her feet. Something had awoken. She turned and fled the building, pushing through reeds until she reached the school perimeter. Lights burned in the windows, and a janitor moved inside, oblivious. She reached her car, opened the door, and sat in the driver's seat, breathing slowly until her hands stopped shaking. That night she dreamed again. Nora sat on the floor of her old nursery, surrounded by toys. Her skin shimmered faintly in the lamplight. She looked up and smiled. "We're almost done," she said. "Done with what?" Darla asked. "Building me." Then she opened her mouth, and Darla saw something inside. Something growing, twisting, moving independently of her body. The sound it made was not human. Part 5. Darla stood out Councilman Brahm's office for 20 minutes before she knocked. The door was already cracked, and his voice called out before her knuckles made contact with the wood. "Come in." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The councilman sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, a stack of manila folders spread across the surface. His hands moved carefully over a blueprint once she recognized from her early research. It detailed a proposed expansion to the marsh trail, a recreational walking loop that would pass directly over the same buried structure she'd found beneath the school. He looked up as she approached. "Nurse Wynne," he said. "I heard you've been under the weather. I'm glad to see you're back on your feet." "I saw the drain," he said without greeting. "I saw what's under it." He paused for a moment, then closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands neatly on top of it. "I see," he said. It must have been very upsetting. I found infant remains, she said. I found growth chambers. I found barrels, hundreds of them. I don't know what you think you saw, he said, but that area is off limits for a reason. There are structural hazards, collapsing ground, unstable waste containers, biohazards from 30 years ago. Nothing down there is active. Darla took a step forward and placed a photograph on his desk. It showed a malformed fetus, one of Crest's oldest images, with a handwritten label, "Sample recovered from drain core, viable until week 18. Brom's face remained still, but a slight tension entered his posture. That came from your dump site, she said, and it's still producing. You know that. You've always known that. You're making accusations you can't support. I have a witness, she said. I had one at least. You killed him. Brom stood from his chair, walked to the window, and stared out at the courtyard below, where children ran in circles around the jungle gym. I never killed anyone, he said, but I've spent my career protecting this town from things it couldn't afford to know. People talk about cleanups, about exposure, about litigation, but if the truth came out in 1984, Greener Hollow would have died overnight. We would have lost everything. So we buried it, literally, and we moved forward. Into what? Darla asked. A town full of sick children and missing babies? Into stability, he said, into progress. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Darla stepped back. You're a monster. No, Brom said. I'm a custodian. He turned back toward his desk and reached for his coat. If you go to the media with this, they'll dismiss you. You don't have names, you don't have dates, and your only expert witness is dead. All you do will be to frighten people. I'm not here to frighten them, Darla said. I'm here to end it. That night, she returned to the marsh one final time. The trail to the drainage tunnel was saturated from recent rain, and each step produced a sickening suction sound beneath her boots. She wore a full-body coverall scavenged from the school's science lab, sealed at the wrists and ankles with tape. A mask covered her mouth, and a headlamp strapped over her forehead illuminated the reeds before her. She crossed the threshold of a collapsed fence and descended into the drainage corridor. As the air grew colder with each step, the tunnel's walls glistened with condensation, and a steady trickle of fluid ran along the center channel. The scent was sharper now, less chemical, more organic. It reminded her of a maternity ward after delivery when blood and antiseptic mixed in the air. She followed the slope downward past the place where the barrels had burst, and the walls began to thrum beneath the film of organic growth. The deeper chamber lay just ahead, hidden by a formidable curtain of membrane now drawn across the passage like a biological veil. She pressed through it. The interior had changed. What had once been a hollowed-out pit lined with barrels had become something monstrous. Its surfaces veined and pulsing. Dozens of sacks lined the walls, each containing a partially formed infant or something close to it. Some floated in fluid, others twitched weakly as she passed. The central floor had sunken, forming a shallow basin filled with viscous dark fluid. In the center of it lay the creature, the thing in the drain. Its shape defied anatomy. Parts of it resembled a fetus, limbs curled, head oversized, spine still partially unfused. But its size exceeded that of any infant. Its skin stretched tight over muscles that throbbed independently. Umbilical cords tethered it to the rusted remains of the old barrels, still draining their contents into its body. She stepped closer. The thing shifted. Its head tilted, though no eyes remained. Its mouth opened and closed slowly, expelling breath in long, wet exhalations. From behind it, a smaller figure emerged. This one was childlike in shape, more coherent, more defined than the other forms. Its limbs moved with control, its face shimmered with familiarity. Nora. She stepped from the fluid and walked toward Darla with unnatural grace. Her feet left no prints in the membrane beneath her. "You came," Nora said. Darla could not speak. "I missed you," Nora continued. "I waited so long. I learned how to speak. I learned how to shape things. I made myself from pieces." Darla raised the flashlight, but the beam flickered and died. The headlamp dimmed. Nora's eyes reflected nothing, her skin undulating rhythmically. "I wanted to come home," she said, "but they wouldn't let me leave." Behind her, the larger creature began to rise, its limbs uncurled, and the cords connecting it to the barrels tensed and drew fluid with a sucking sound. Darla stepped back. Nora extended her hand. "You don't have to be afraid," she said. "You left me once, but you don't have to leave again." "I didn't leave," Darla whispered. "You were taken from me." "I was given to something else," Nora said. "It needed a blueprint. You gave it one." Behind them, the walls trembled, the sacks bulged, and several burst, releasing steam and fluid into the air. The thing in the drain groaned, a sound that reverberated through Darla's chest. Then another voice echoed through the chamber. "I see it now," Councilman Brome said. He stood at the edge of the passage, a gas can in one hand and a lit flare in the other. "This is what we covered up. This is what we let grow." "Don't," Darla said. "You'll kill everything, including the children." "Those aren't children," Brome said. "They're failures, attempts, mutations." "They're not finished," Darla said. "They're still forming. They're trying to become something." Brome lit the flare. "I can't let this continue," he said. "Even if I die here, it ends." He tossed the flare into the chamber. Fire burst across the membrane and ignited the air. The sacks erupted in flame. The creature shrieked, not a sound made by lungs or throat, but by muscle tearing against itself. Darla ran. She leapt over the channel, scrambled up the corridor, and burst through the grate into the open marsh. The sky above it darkened, rife with smoke and steam. Behind her, the earth convulsed. The ground collapsed inward, dragging reeds, soil, and remnants of the structure down into a yawning sinkhole. The fire consumed the corridor as the creature thrashed one final time and vanished beneath the rising water. Sirens approached in the distance. Darla collapsed near the edge of the school's rear parking lot, coughing against the smoke and staring at the widening hole where the drain had been. By the time the first responders arrived, the marsh had swallowed the structure completely. In the official report, the event was labeled a spontaneous ground collapse, accelerated by a methane buildup from decaying industrial waste. No survivors were listed. Brome's body was never recovered. No mention was made of fetuses, growth sacs, or biological structures. Darla returned home under supervision. She was interviewed, evaluated, and cleared. The incident was deemed psychologically destabilizing, and she was granted indefinite leave. 3 weeks later, she uploaded every file she'd collected to a public server and mailed anonymous copies to 4 investigative journalists. She waited. The stories were published, but quickly dismissed as hoaxes. Photos were flagged as altered, sources discredited. The town moved on. Granger Hollow Elementary was permanently closed. The land was deemed geologically unstable and reclassified as protected wetlands. The school was torn down, the rubble used to reinforce the banks of the surrounding marsh. 6 months passed. Then, one morning, a child was found wrapped in a blanket on the steps of a rural church 2 counties each. The note left with the infant read only, "She belongs to the water, but not anymore." The nurse on duty swaddled the girl and smiled down at her. She had perfect skin, perfect hands, perfect features, but her eyelids shimmered faintly, and beneath them, when they moved, The eyes had no whites. That was Barrel Babies by Devon Kess, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
You know it's bad when the marsh talks back. Worse when it calls you mommy. That one will linger like a chemical spill.
Yeah, the kind of story that makes you think twice about what's trickling through your drain pipes or growing under your feet.
Coming up next, we descend into a kitchen where love lingers and the stew pot never goes cold. When Wendell lost his wife, he didn't expect her to stay gone, not really. And with every batch of stew he ladles from the old cast-iron pot, he gets just a little closer to hearing her voice again. This is Leftovers by Miranda Blackwell, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Part 1. The Greaves homestead sat at the base of a glacial valley, where the tree line dipped and staggered in crooked, snow-heavy steps. It had been Wendell's for 20 years and Marianne's for 15. The structure was nothing special. A 2-story A-frame flanked by a tool shed, a buried propane tank, and the wood shed they replenished together every September. But the land had been chosen with a particular kind of silence in mind. Not the kind you get in city basements or hotel rooms with double-glazed windows. The real kind. The kind that presses itself into your bones and won't leave even when you ask it nicely. They liked it that way. No neighbors and no phone lines. No interruptions or intrusions. Unfortunately, it also meant that no help was coming. By the time the first storm rolled round the ridge that winter, they were already stocked. Root vegetables wrapped in burlap, meat sealed in waxed paper and plastic, broth in lard frozen solid in mason jars. Wendell had rotated the solar batteries twice already. The generator worked fine, though they seldom used it. And in the center of it all, like some old shrine, sat the black cast-iron stew pot that had belonged to Marianne's grandmother, a big-bellied antique with lion feet and a soot-slick lid. It never left the stovetop. Wendell sometimes joked it was her real husband. "Not funny," she said every single time. "That pot fed 3 generations before me. It knows things." He always chuckled and nodded and let the silence hang, pretending not to wonder what she meant by that. On the day she died, they had been arguing over the ham hocks. "Too much salt," she'd said. "You know your heart's not what it used to be." "I didn't salt it," Wendell replied. "You salted it last fall. It's been in the freezer ever since." "Well then, the pot likes it that way. We'll blame it." He rolled his eyes and tried to hide the smile, and she'd whacked his arm with a dish towel before going down to the cellar for more parsnips. That was the last thing she ever said. Wendell heard the fall, but didn't react right away. It was a strange sound, a thud, like that of a duffel bag being dropped. He called down once, but received no answer. Then again, louder. His legs didn't want to move, but he made them, carrying the flashlight and their last working lantern. He found her at the bottom of the cellar stairs, one arm twisted beneath her, eyes open and glassy. Blood had bloomed behind her skull and spread like ink into the packed dirt. Her fingers twitched once before going still. Wendell stood there for a long time, the lantern in his left hand painting her features with a fluttering orange glow. He didn't call for help, didn't run, didn't scream. There was no point. The radio was down. The phone had never worked up there. And even if the weather hadn't already dropped 3 feet of snow between them and the nearest ranger outpost, no one was coming for days. He went back up the stairs, picked up the dish towel, and folded it neatly beside the sink. He didn't bury her. Couldn't, really. The ground outside had gone rigid, sealed with ice and dry-packed snow. He wasn't strong enough to cut through it, and the shed only had a post-hole digger. So he wrapped her in a blue tarp, the kind they used to cover the woodpile, and dragged her gently to the far end of the basement where it stayed coldest. The meat freezer was already full. The storm would keep her. He built a fire. He sat in silence for hours. When his stomach finally reminded him of the time, he rose on autopilot, ladled some broth from the tin by the stove, and lit the gas under the stew pot. It clanked softly as it heated, then began to hum with a slow, oily burble. He spoke to her as it warmed. "I used the beef we set aside in October," he said. "The one with the good marbling. You said to save it for a special occasion." Outside, the wind made the windows complain. "I don't know if this counts, but I think you'd forgive me for that." The pot let out a little hiss. Just moisture escaping. Just steam. He poured in the broth, added carrots, bay leaf, garlic, and half a dried onion. It smelled just like her version. So close, he felt his chest tighten. Her favorite wooden spoon, the one with the worn-down handle and the dark stripe from too many burns, sat waiting by the cutting board. He used it like a ritual. That night, he sat at their table and ate 2 full bowls. The taste was right, uncannily right. But it wasn't just the seasoning, it was the memory. Something about the mouthfeel, the slow unfolding of flavor at the back of his tongue, the way it lingered just beneath the nasal cavity. It felt like her, as though a part of her was sitting there across from him, watching, approving. He even looked once, just a glance over the rim of his bowl, and of course no one was there. He chuckled without humor, set down the spoon, and poured himself the last of their blackberry wine. The bottle had dust on it, but the cork had held. "To your stew," he said aloud, raising the glass. The house creaked in the wind. Days passed, or weeks. The storm never really broke. It just sagged and pressed in heavier. The world outside the windows went gray, then white, then gray again. Wendell kept the fire alive, kept cooking, kept speaking to her, especially when the pot was bubbling. He didn't know why he kept using it. Habit, maybe, or superstition. Or maybe it was just because the meals always came out better when he used it. The vegetables softened just right. The meat practically fell apart on the tongue. He stopped trying to vary the recipes after a while. Always the same stew, always the same bowl. He caught himself speaking to her in second person again. He'd read somewhere that was a sign of complicated grief. But that's what they were. Complicated. And grief didn't stop him from being hungry. The meat was still holding up okay. Still a few sealed cuts in the bottom freezer, enough to stretch. But the day he pulled out a package he couldn't remember wrapping, something shifted. It was labeled in her handwriting, thick black marker, no date, just "Save for spring, high fat." He turned it over in his hands. The wrap was intact. The seal had held. It looked like meat, dark red, marbled, dense. It smelled sweet. He stared at it for a while before placing it on the counter. Then he turned to the pot, already heating, and said, "You sure about this one?" A gust of wind made the stovepipe moan. The pot burbled softly just as it always did. He unwrapped the cut, didn't look too closely. Added garlic, thyme, a splash of vinegar, a little tallow for depth, and stirred. That night, the stew tasted incredible. He wept over the bowl, not because he missed her, not even because he knew something was wrong, but because it felt, for just a moment, like she had returned. Part 2. The pot had weight, and not just in pounds. Wendell felt it every time he lifted the lid, like it resisted, just slightly, as though it had something to say before being opened. It was subtle, mechanical even, easy to rationalize. But he started noticing it after the 5th stew in a row. Something about the timing, how it never boiled too fast or too slow, how the seasoning always seemed perfectly distributed no matter how distracted he was during prep. It made him think of those old folk tales Marianne liked to recite when they sat by the fire, about witches who cooked memory into soup, about pots that remembered the souls they fed. He hadn't believed in that kind of thing, still didn't. But he didn't mock her for it either. That had always been part of their agreement. She could call the pot an heirloom with a soul, and he could call it cast iron and leave it at that. But now she was gone, and the damn thing still hummed at him like it had something left to finish. He told himself it was grief. Then he found the recipe. It had been tucked inside an old recipe binder beneath the flour sack drawer. He'd opened it, searching for lentils. What he found instead was an envelope, sealed with dried wax, Marianne's seal, the one she used for handmade cards and canning labels. It was shaped like a fern frond. The envelope bore no name, no date. Inside were 4 things. 1, a single sheet of thick, yellowed paper. 2, a sprig of what looked like dried sage, but sweeter smelling. 3, a tiny photo, black and white, grainy, of an unfamiliar woman stirring a pot in what looked like a cabin much like theirs. 4, a handwritten note on lined paper titled Memory Stew. Wendell sat at the table and read the recipe, twice. It started off innocent enough. Root vegetables, salt, marrow-rich cuts, water from the spring. But the farther he got, the more cryptic it became. The pot remembers if you feed it in order. The broth takes the shape of the one who loved you most. If you speak aloud while stirring, she will listen. If you eat alone, she will return. The last line was scratched in ink that had bled through the page. But beware, she may come hungry. Wendell didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He just folded the paper and set it beside the photo, careful not to smudge the dried leaves still clinging to the envelope. He'd heard her say the phrase memory stew once before, years ago, a joke between her and her niece Ellie when Ellie came to visit and brought takeout. He had thought it was nonsense then. Now, he wasn't so sure. The next stew came together differently, not rushed, not ritualistic, just careful. He followed the recipe to the letter, except for the final line. He didn't speak out loud while stirring. Not at first. The meat that day came from a package labeled Elk 21, which should have meant late-season meat from the year before. It had been sealed well, but he didn't remember the kill. And when he cut it open, the scent that greeted him was wrong. Not spoiled, not rancid, but familiar in a way that made his throat tighten. He used it anyway. The pot hissed as the cubes of meat met the fat. The garlic joined soon after, then carrots, then potato. Wendell stood at the stove and stirred, the wooden spoon whispering against the iron in soft concentric motions. If you speak aloud while stirring, she will listen. He thought about it, felt stupid, said nothing. Then, halfway through his second turn around the pot, The words slipped out like someone else had thought them for him. "I miss you." The broth trembled, just a ripple. Could have been the wind in the chimney. He stirred once more. "I wish you were here to taste this." The wind stopped. For 1 second, maybe 2, he heard a sigh from the corner of the room. The soft, tired exhale of someone settling into a chair after a long day. He looked over his shoulder. Nothing. Just the old rocking chair beside the stove, still as stone. That night, he dreamt of her. Not the memory version his mind had served up in recent nights. Soft focus, incomplete, stitched together from old photographs and better days. No, this was her. Clear, grounded, more detailed than his mind had any right to remember. She was in the kitchen, barefoot in her sleep pants, stirring the pot while humming the same lullaby her grandmother used to sing, something in Romanian. He didn't know the words, but he knew the tune. He reached for her, could feel the warmth of her skin. She turned and kissed his cheek. "Salt," she said. "Needs more salt." When he woke, the stew was already bubbling on the stove. The next few days bled together. He cooked, he stirred, he spoke aloud. Sometimes it was just memories, her old sayings, stories she liked to tell, things she used to mutter while dicing onions. But other times the words felt like they weren't entirely his, as though someone else were threading thoughts into his mouth mid-sentence. He'd catch himself saying things he didn't mean to, like calling the pot dear or whispering, "There you are," when lifting the lid. He didn't stop. Couldn't. Each time he tasted the stew, her voice grew clearer. She asked questions now, simple ones. "Do you remember the garden? Have you checked the pantry yet? Did you sleep last night?" And one evening, as he sat on the couch with the bowl in his lap, her voice asked, "Will you let me stay?" Wendell froze. He didn't answer, but he didn't throw the bowl away either. The pot never burned, not once, even when he left it unattended for hours, even when the fire ran too hot. The contents never scorched, never boiled over. And the stew, it evolved, became richer, more nuanced, as though the pot were adjusting the flavor for him personally. Some nights it had a sweetness he couldn't trace. Other times it had a tang of vinegar or wine, despite him not adding either. He told himself he was using old ingredients. He told himself the freezer was mislabeled. He told himself he didn't recognize the meat because she'd stored it, not him. But one afternoon, digging through the lower shelf of the freezer, he found a small plastic package marked, "For him. Do not open until spring." It was wrapped in white butcher paper, and the handwriting was hers. The letters were rushed, uneven. Inside was a single cut of meat, pink-white, pale with fat and strangely lean in the middle. No bone, just flesh. He stood holding it for a long time. When he brought it to the stove, the pot clinked softly as he set it down, as if in acknowledgement. He added turnip, parsley, tallow, a dash of dried wine from the cupboard, and stirred. That night, the stew was thicker. He chewed more slowly. The broth was darker. The meat had a silkier texture, not stringy like venison or chewy like goat. It flaked apart like overcooked lamb, but it wasn't lamb. He knew that much. He didn't want to think about it too long. As he ate, she spoke to him, not beside him, not around him, but from within. "I never wanted to go," You know that, right? I didn't plan for it to happen that way. I'm sorry." His eyes watered. From heat, maybe, or something else. He set down the spoon halfway through the bowl and listened. The fireplace crackled behind him. "It doesn't have to end, Wendell." He said nothing. "Just one more night. Just one more bowl." He looked at the pot. It wasn't boiling. It was waiting. Part 3. By the second week of the thaw, Wendell had stopped keeping track of the days. The weather outside meant nothing. He went out only when the firewood ran low or the smell of the unshoveled outhouse became too much to bear. Otherwise, he kept to the house, the kitchen, the pot. He developed new habits without realizing it, stirring in figure eights instead of circles, speaking to the stew before tasting it, sleeping in his armchair instead of their bed. The chair was closer to the pot, closer to her. He'd stopped thinking of it as madness. Madness didn't bring warmth. It didn't whisper lullabies in the voice of your dead wife. Didn't hum the same half-Romanian tune in perfect pitch each night as the stew came to boil. Something had changed inside the house. He felt it in the walls, in the warping of light just after dusk, in the way her perfume bloomed at the top of the stairs before vanishing again. The stew had become more than food. It was something else now. Bridge, channel, sacrament. He didn't have a word for it, but he knew the rules. If he stirred and spoke, she would listen. If he ate alone, she would return. And return she did. It started with a scent, her favorite lilac and white musk perfume, which she hadn't worn in years, not since they'd gone fully off-grid. He caught it strongest while the stew was on, and lingering faintly for hours after. He found himself holding onto it like a tether, standing still in the hallway just to breathe it in. Then came the sounds. Floorboards creaking in patterns he recognized. The soft click of the kettle lid being placed beside the sink. The faint rustle of pages turning in the other room. He tried once to follow the sound, opened the bedroom door expecting silence, maybe his own echo. Instead, the radio was playing. It shouldn't have been. It hadn't worked since the battery box died in November, but there it was. WEVV, their old public broadcast station out of Missoula. Faint, warped, grainy. A voice was reading from Little House in the Big Woods, one of her favorites. He didn't change the dial, just sat down and listened, bowl in hand. The voice kept going. When she started answering his questions, he didn't find it strange. "Do you remember when you brought me here for the first time?" he'd asked aloud one night. "You tracked mud through the whole cabin," came her reply, warm and amused, right behind his ear. Then blamed it on the dog. "We didn't have a dog." "Thought maybe it'd spare me some scolding." Didn't work, did it? He laughed. Actually laughed. It felt like a memory, but deeper, more immediate, like the words weren't just remembered, but shared, as though they were speaking from opposite ends of the same breath. He found he could feel her smile sometimes, not see or hear it, but actually feel it, like warmth on his shoulder, similarly to the way her hand used to press his back when she leaned in to taste his cooking. She touched him in dreams, too, lightly, with intention. And when she said his name, it didn't echo the way dreams usually do. It landed. The stew had grown richer. Every night brought new depth to it, textures and layers he didn't add, seasonings he didn't own. Some nights it was savory and soft, others sharp with fermented tang. Once it had an anise-like flavor that turned his stomach and then left him crying like a child without knowing why. He stopped using the pantry entirely. Whatever the stew needed, the pot seemed to find. He'd wake from his chair to the scent of it cooking, the fire still alive, the pot still bubbling. He couldn't remember cutting anything, couldn't remember adding wood. His arms and hands had the dull ache of recent use. But the meals were always perfect. It was after one of these nights he caught himself talking with his mouth full. Not just talking, conversing. She was telling him a story about her childhood, about a girl who used to bully her at Sunday school. Wendell responded without thinking, chewing slowly, nodding along. Then he stopped. His spoon hovered midair. The stew was still hot, still steaming. The voice inside his head continued. She pulled my braids and told me Baba's stew smelled like dirt. So I switched to communion wafer with a dried beet. Served her right. Wendell swallowed hard. Marianne? Still here? He looked at the pot, then at the bowl, then back at the chair across from him. Where are you? You know where. Her voice was still soft, still hers, but it echoed now, not in the house, in him. The pressure behind his eyes, the murmuring along his spine, the flicker of memory that wasn't his. He could feel her in his chest, in his gut, in the corners of thought where he usually kept silence. The stew was no longer food. It was her. He tried, once, not to eat it. Tried to leave the pot cold, to go the day on bread and beans and melted snow. But by dusk, his hands were shaking. His tongue felt too large in his mouth. His joints ached as though he'd been left out in the cold. Her voice whispered all day, gently, persistently. You're hungry. Why are you doing this? I thought we wanted to be together. He ignored her and sat on the couch, wrapping himself in her old sweater. But by nightfall, the smell of the stew, somehow hot and cooking even without flame, filled the kitchen again. The pot hissed softly. The lid clinked once. He approached it like a man approaching the scene of his own execution. Did you do this? You did. You always make the best meals. No, It's all right. I know it's hard. You can stop fighting. I'm not mad. I just want to be close. He lifted the lid. Steam bloomed upward, sweet and fatty. He wept as he ate. It happened during the second blackout. The solar batteries had finally drained to nothing, and the wind had brought the power lines down in the valley days ago. He didn't care. He'd stopped using the lights. The fire and the pot were all he needed. He woke up on the kitchen floor, cold, cramping, and barefoot. The stew was cooking. A fresh cut of meat floated in the broth, pink at the edges, ivory in the center. He didn't remember cutting anything or lighting the stove. His hands were trembling, his mouth dry. He looked around the room. The freezer door was open, and the top from the basement was gone. That's when he noticed the footprints. Wet, red-tinged prints led from the back stairs to the kitchen, wide and dragging, like something had been hauled across the floor. The tarp lay half-folded near the pantry door, darkened with fluids that had soaked into the grain. The sharp smell of iron hung in the air. Wendell dropped the spoon. He followed the prints slowly, not wanting to see, but unable to resist. Down the stairs, back into the cellar, he went. The cold hit his lungs like broken glass. He turned on the old battery-powered lantern. Its low light flickered, dimly illuminating his surroundings. And he discovered what was left of her. The tarp had been unwrapped. Inside, scattered like scraps from a butcher's table, lay ribs, vertebrae, the clean scoop of her pelvis. Her skull, mostly intact, had been propped gently against the wall, her jaw still attached by a string of dried tissue. Her left hand was missing. The right one clutched the edge of a stained recipe card. Wendell stumbled backward, lantern shaking in his grip. The floor beneath him was sticky. It took every ounce of strength not to vomit. He fell to his knees, cried out. Something broke in his chest. "You weren't supposed to see me like this." Her voice came not from above, not from behind, but from within, close, inside his spine, threaded between his ribs. He clutched his head. "God, Marianne, what have I done?" "You didn't do anything wrong. You missed me. I missed you too." "This is wrong. This is sick. You're the one who started cooking. I just came home." "I ate you." Silence. Then, gently, "Not all of me. I'm still here." He looked at the bones, then at his hands. His palms were stained pink, fingernails caked with blackened stew. He had done this. He had fed himself her memory, her essence, her flesh. And he still wanted more. "Don't leave me again," she said. He closed his eyes and felt her press against him from the inside. He didn't know if this was possession or madness. Didn't care anymore. Either way, he wasn't alone. The next day, the radio crackled. "Sundown Ridge Station, come in. This is Mason Harrow at District Base. Anyone there?" Wendell stared at it for a long time before lifting the receiver. His voice sounded strange, slightly higher, smooth at the edges. "This is Greaves. Cabin's intact. Roads passable by foot." Static, then. "Jesus, Wendell, you're alive. We've got a team headed in today. You've got visitors." Wendell looked toward the stove. The pot bubbled softly. He turned the radio off. Behind his teeth, something smiled. Part 4. The radio sat dead now. He turned it off after speaking with Ranger Harrow and hadn't touched it since. Once the signal died again in the storm's wake, he didn't bother to re-establish contact. What would he have said anyway? "Come quickly, I've been eating my dead wife, and she started talking from inside my brain?" No. Better to wait. Better to let things finish. The pot was already simmering when he woke the next morning, despite the fire being little more than glowing embers. The smell crept upstairs before the light did, rich, meaty, laced with something floral and honey-sweet beneath the fat. He knew what it meant. She was feeding herself now. No more denial. No more pretending the meat was old venison or mislabeled elk or something from before her death. No more letting the pot speak for him. He'd eaten her, slowly, reverently, not in some monstrous frenzy, not in madness or malice, but one bowl at a time, telling himself it was memory, communion, nostalgia. But now it was hunger, and he couldn't tell whose it was anymore. He stopped using mirrors. Every time he saw his face, it looked different. Not dramatically, he wasn't seeing someone else staring back. But the eyes sat wrong. The mouth moved too easily, too expressively. His shoulders curved in when he walked, like hers used to. His hands lingered on objects, fingertips pressing into cloth and wood like they were savoring textures. He started humming. Not consciously, the tune just leaked out of him. Old Romanian verses Marianne used to whisper while kneading dough or grinding herbs. He didn't know the lyrics, but his voice carried them all the same. He stopped noticing when the transitions happened. One moment, he'd be seated by the fire, mind blank watching the snow. The next, he'd be stirring the pot, ladling stew, chewing softly while the warmth climbed up through his bones and into his skull. Sometimes, it was her doing the chewing. He could feel it. He tried once to stop. After finding what was left of her in the cellar, he'd sworn, genuinely sworn, to let the stew rot, to let the pot go cold. He unplugged the propane line, boarded the stove shut with a crossbar of pine, sat shaking in the bedroom for hours, starving, aching, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The pain came first, not just hunger, but withdrawal, limbs seizing, stomach twisting in dry spasms. Then the voice. "You're hurting yourself. Don't do this to us. You promised." "I didn't promise anything," he whispered into the dark. "You didn't have to. I know you. I am you now." That last part was said not aloud, but through him, a thought not fully formed, an echo reverberating in his bones. She was more than just present now. She was inhabiting, migrating. That night, he blacked out. When he awoke, the kitchen was warm again. The boards were gone, the stove was lit, and the pot was full. He found himself staring into the mirror above the sink a few mornings later, searching for some last fragment of who he used to be. His mouth smiled without permission. It wasn't wide, just a soft little tilt, the way she used to do when she was about to tell a lie. He spoke. "Don't I look good, Wendell?" His lips moved. The voice was his, but the tone, the cadence, hers. He stepped back, bumped into the counter. "Stop it." No response. "I said stop." Another smile. "You're scared," she whispered through his throat. "That's all right. I was scared too, but now we're together." "This isn't what I wanted." "It's what I needed." He gripped the edge of the sink, knuckles white. "You're stealing me." "No, I'm finishing you." And the truth of it hit hard. She wasn't killing him. She was overwriting, erasing, adopting his posture, his tone, his memories. Each bowl had brought her closer. Each bite had hollowed him out. He was nothing more than her transitional form now, her chrysalis, and the shell was almost shed. 3 days before the Rangers arrived, Wendell walked into the basement for the last time. Not because he'd hoped to bury her, or even to make peace, but because something was missing. He had started to forget her voice, her true voice, the one from their life together, the one that said his name with warmth, that hummed while chopping carrots, that read the almanac aloud by the fire. He remembered the inflection, but not the pitch. He stood in the cellar beside her bones and realized he didn't recognize the person they belonged to. The hand had gone missing, the skull had been turned inward, and the jaw had been removed. And at the foot of the mess, the stew pot lid rested, clean and gleaming. Not in the kitchen or on the stove, but here. He hadn't brought it down, but all the same, it was waiting. He knelt beside it and touched the iron and found it warm. "You see now," she said, inside his chest. "Yes." "You understand?" she continued. "I do," he replied. "Then you know what comes next." He did. He lifted the lid. It hissed, not with heat, but with breath. Her breath. His breath. The same breath. The rescue came sooner than expected. Wendell, what remained of him, stood in the snow with one hand raised as the snowmobiles approached. His boots were wet, but he didn't feel it. His fingers shook slightly, but not from cold. Sergeant Harrow was the first to dismount. "Jesus, Wendell," he said, pulling off his goggles. "You look like hell." "I feel wonderful," Wendell replied, and he meant it. His voice was smooth and measured, his posture straight, his eyes calm, but the rest of the team saw what they needed to see. Weeks of unwashed clothing, hollow cheeks, wild hair. A man surviving on the edge. They had no reason to suspect otherwise. Not yet. Harrow clapped him on the back and guided him toward the snowmobile. "You'll need a medic, maybe a shrink, but you're alive, man. You made it." Wendell smiled. The real horror came later when they searched the cabin, found the cellar, and opened the freezer and discovered the remains. Some of the Rangers vomited. Others went quiet. It was unmistakable. Mary Ann had not only died in that house, she'd been dismantled in it, methodically, cooked and consumed. The pot tested positive for human tissue. The notebooks, especially the memory stew recipe, matched her handwriting, and Wendell's prints were on everything. Everything. They arrested him at the field clinic, where he was undergoing a psychiatric evaluation. He didn't resist, didn't speak either, not for days. When Dr. Lena Moreau finally got him to talk, it was slow going. He remembered nothing of the stew, nothing of the cellar. He described long periods of feeling watched, of dreams that spilled into waking. He said he had mourned his wife, then he paused and corrected himself. "I mourned our wife." Dr. Moreau wrote it off as trauma-induced identity fracture, dissociative psychosis, cannibalistic fugue. But one night, as she packed her things after a long session, he spoke again, with the same smile, the same calm. She wanted to live. Dr. Moreau looked up from her bag. "I'm sorry?" "She didn't want to go, and I can't blame her." He leaned forward, resting his chin on one palm. "You should have tasted her stew." The trial never happened. Wendell was found unfit to stand on grounds of extreme psychological collapse, committed indefinitely to a forensic psychiatric hospital in eastern Montana. They gave him a cell with a window. He asked for books, recipes, and paper to write on. He never raised his voice, never resisted medication, but the nurses talked behind closed doors about the way he walked, hips just slightly off-center, like he was wearing someone else's bones. How he touched his face too often, like he was still getting used to it. How he'd stand at the sink for minutes at a time, just watching his reflection, smiling that same quiet smile. One nurse swore he hummed lullabies in a language she didn't recognize. And once, just once, He whispered something from the mirror's edge. I told him I'd stay. Part 5. The name on the hospital intake form was Wendell James Greaves. Male, age 58. No known history of psychosis. Survivor of prolonged isolation during the 2024 deep freeze event in the Black Pine region. Suspected involvement in the death and cannibalization of his wife, Marianne Greaves. The man who signed the form did so with a steady hand, but the signature didn't match the samples from 5 years earlier. Not exactly. The letters had curves now, an almost cursive flourish in the G, a lean on the W that suggested someone used to writing grocery lists in loops and margins. When the nurse asked if he was feeling all right, he smiled and said, I'm getting used to things. Time passed differently in the hospital. There was structure, of course, meal times, head counts, group therapy, but it all bled together like paint in warm water. The man in room 11 adjusted quickly. Too quickly, some thought. He adapted to the medication and reported no side effects. He exercised daily, participated, and spoke politely to the staff. Too polite. Not crazy, they whispered. Off. The way he watched people, the way he folded towels, the way that he stared at the pot in the communal kitchen as though he was waiting for it to say something. One morning, a staff member caught him pressing his cheek against the refrigerator door, whispering, Too cold for sour broth. You'll curdle if you rush it. He looked up, blinking, and said, Oh, sorry, habit. No one asked what he'd meant. In private sessions, Dr. Moreau tried to reach Wendell, what little was left of him, but every time she pushed, she met someone else. The man in the chair knew things he shouldn't. Recipes passed down from old world kitchens, ones not published anywhere. He described herbs she couldn't identify, rattled off Slavic phrases in perfect cadence. Once, he corrected her pronunciation of borscht and cited 3 regional variations by temperature and pickling length. I'm not Wendell, he told her once. I'm just what was left after Wendell was finished. She asked what that meant. I'm the one who made the stew. His eyes never left hers. But Wendell served it. The remains of Marianne Greaves were buried in a shared grave near Blackwater Hollow. A memorial stone was erected with both their names. No family came to claim the body. No one wanted the pot. It sat for weeks in the evidence locker of the county sheriff's department. Then, without explanation, the clerk on duty reported it missing. There were no signs of forced entry, no video footage, only an empty shelf. The room smelled faintly of time for 3 days afterward. Back in room 11, Wendell began keeping a journal. The staff found it one day tucked neatly beneath his mattress. It wasn't filmed with confessions or regrets. It was a cookbook, titled in careful handwriting, Things Worth Remembering. Each page contained a memory, a moment, a taste. Every one of them began with, I made this for you, followed by a description of the occasion, a late autumn dinner, an anniversary, a night she'd had a bad dream. Each memory was tied to a dish, and each dish ended with the same line. You came back to me that night. The final page was blank, save for a single phrase at the bottom. But at what cost? The months turned, seasonal staff rotating in and out, but Wendell remained, still polite, still present, still humming lullabies under his breath when he thought no one was listening. He never mentioned Marianne again, not by name. But during one particularly quiet session, Dr. Moreau asked him what he thought about redemption. He looked at his hands, familiar now, though still slightly alien in the fingers, and said, Redemption's a stew you only get to make once. She asked him to explain. He looked up, smiled with someone else's mouth, and said, "You have to start with love and then ruin it." Sometimes in the middle of the night, he dreams of himself. Not Wendell, herself. The way she used to be, taller, lighter, filled with laughter and wine, dancing in the kitchen, stirring the pot with her wooden spoon, flicking broth at Wendell when he teased her. She misses that woman, misses the warmth of her own hands, the hair she could tie up in a knot, the voice that sounded like her grandmother's when she said bedtime prayers. Now, all of that is behind glass and bone and other people's voices. A prison, one she built. Wendell's life is over, and hers is a sentence. But at least she's breathing. At least she's alive. And for someone who once feared the quiet of the grave, that's enough. For now. That was Leftovers by Miranda Blackwell, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood.
They say grief is a recipe without a guide, but that pot, it sure didn't need instructions.
You just have to feed it right, Otis. Stir with love, and maybe a little something extra.
And speaking of voices and places they don't belong, our next story takes us to a tower where the wires don't just carry power, they carry something far older and far more dangerous. The old transmission pole. Storm-drenched hillside, a body lashed to the wires, and a voice that never belonged to any man. This is Crossarm by Vincent Noakes, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. The storm had been brutal. Not just loud, but long and powerful, like something ancient had torn its way through the sky. The kind of wind that ripped signs off gas stations and turned treetops into shrapnel. 100 miles of damage lay in its wake, power out from Fargo to the Dakota's western edge. Louis Cortez stepped out of the cab of the service truck and closed the door with a firm shove. A latch clicked against the frame, the only clean sound for miles. Everything else was soaked, sagging, or steaming. The air still carried that scorched ozone smell storms always left behind. Metallic and not quite real. The gravel beneath his boots squelched with black puddles as he scanned the tree line. "Anything?" he asked without turning. Keith Moan had already slung a climbing harness over one shoulder, his grease-stained work gloves poking out from his back pocket. "Lines are dead out here," Keith said, which is weird because this sector still shows load. Not a lot, but enough to matter. Louis adjusted his hard hat and reached back into the cab to grab his field tablet. "Some relay must be still drawing current," he said. "Could be a buried junction, could be a smart meter fried half closed." Keith grunted and looked out toward the horizon. The ridge ahead was studded with a splinter of what used to be pine stand. One tree had snapped clean down the middle, its top half dangling like a broken limb. A few 100 feet beyond, the transmission corridor cut a path through the hills. "You ever hear of a station this far out?" Keith asked. Louis shook his head. Last mile should end near Walker's Bluff. Anything past that's wilderness or ghost towers. Keith leaned against the fender and pulled a thermos from his jacket. He didn't drink, he just held it for warmth. "Then why in the hell are we getting pull from something out here?" Louis didn't answer right away. His screen showed a modest but steady current draw flagged with a frequency anomaly. A low pulsing cycle that wasn't on the standard broadcast band. That meant leakage or corruption. Could be a backfeed, somebody running a generator into the grid without an isolator. And somebody is about to cook their house and die in the dark, Keith said. Louis looked up and gave a dry smile. That's why we're here. An hour later, the truck bounced its way up the overgrown access road that hadn't been properly upgraded in years. The tires kicked loose debris from the path, mud, ash, pine needles, bits of wind-torn shingle. Haley's voice crackled over the CB, fighting through occasional bursts of static. Copy, Unit 12, got your position. Be advised, we're still blind to your forward telemetry. Something's jamming relay ID from your location. Louis picked up the mic. Could be the terrain or the fire damage to the uplink. No fire reported in your sector, she said. And that anomaly is getting stronger. It's interfering with my dispatch uplink. Keith rolled his eyes. Probably just a goddamn squirrel nest in a junction box. Haley paused for a moment. Then her voice returned, quieter this time. If you start hearing anything weird, off-pattern interference, bursts in foreign language, anything like that, I need you to log it. Time, duration, and where you were when it happened. Louis glanced over at Keith, who gave a slow shake of the head. Noted, Louis said into the mic. Appreciate it, Haley replied. Call in if you make contact with the source. I'll monitor the sideband until then. The signal faded out with a pop. They found the structure by accident. The service path ended at a clearing where the hillside rose into a jagged bluff. The corridor here had been inactive for decades, its towers marked for decommissioning sometime in the 90s. But standing at the crest of the ridge was a utility pole they hadn't expected. Not a steel lattice tower, this was wood. Massive, thick-beamed, and reinforced with iron strapping. The base had been buried in concrete, now split by roots. Louis stood still at the edge of the clearing and stared at the thing. Keith stepped up beside him, one hand resting on the coil hook of his belt. That wasn't in the specs, he said. No, Louis muttered. Wasn't. The pole stretched nearly 50 feet high, capped by a broad double crossarm, bristling with ceramic insulators. Most of them were cracked. Some hung limp on their brackets, wires trailing. But it wasn't the hardware that stopped them cold. It was the figure lashed across the beam. At first glance, it looked like a scarecrow or maybe some lineman's prank. A humanoid shape bound with black wire and sagging in the middle. But as they got closer, the details sharpened. The body wasn't made of straw or cloth. It was carved, crudely but deliberately, from driftwood or weathered pine. The chest had been scorched and split open, revealing layers of blackened bark beneath. Cables coiled around its limbs and threaded into its midsection. More disturbing, the eyes were empty sockets lined with scorched resin that shimmered slightly in the light. Louis stopped at the base of the pole and looked up. Cables ran from the figure's body into the crossarm itself, disappearing into rusted fittings. Jesus, Keith muttered. It's wired in. Louis raised his field meter and took a slow breath. The signal here was intense. A cycling frequency just below human hearing. He could feel it in his bones like pressure from a coming migraine. It's drawing current, he said quietly. Not much, but enough to matter. What? Keith asked. There's nothing feeding this pole. It's not on the line. Louis walked a slow circle around the base and spotted a shallow trench nearby. Freshly disturbed earth, still warm from the storm. Wires ran from the base of the pole into the ground, angling downward toward the tree line. Keith kicked at the dirt with one boot. You think someone built this? As a monument or something? Louis didn't answer. After a few seconds, Keith spoke again. It looks like a crucifixion. That's what it looks like. Louis didn't disagree. That night, Louis sat alone inside the truck's cab, staring at the signal readout. Keith had gone to sleep hours ago, wrapped in his tarp beneath the overhang, his snores drowned out by the rain. Outside, the cables and the pole shifted slightly in the wind, except there wasn't any wind. The static on the radio shifted, cycling down from white hiss into something almost patterned. Louis turned the dial slowly. At 4.67 megahertz, the sound clicked. "You gave me voice." He froze. The voice was mechanical and raw, like someone had dropped a microphone into a generator fan. It wasn't in English, not exactly. It threaded syllables together with rhythm and cadence, but no consistent grammar. And still, Louis understood it, not consciously or logically, but his mind grasped meaning in the way one feels a warning before a quake. "Why did you wake me?" And the field tablet rebooted itself without warning. When the screen returned, it displayed a waveform, jagged and black, matching the signal's cadence. Louis stared at it until his vision blurred. He heard something move outside. A soft shift of gravel, then another. Louis reached for the door handle but stopped. He realized then he could still hear the voice, but it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from inside the wires. At dawn, Keith climbed the old pole to check the insulators. Louis stood at the base, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched tight. The signal had stopped abruptly just before sunrise, leaving behind a low hum across every device they carried. "Still feel it?" Keith called down. Louis nodded, like pressure behind the ears. Keith grunted. "I thought so." He reached the crossarm and paused. His body stiffened. "Louis." Louis looked up. "There's fresh cable up here. I mean, new. Spliced and bolted like somebody came out here with a field kit and fed this thing in last week." Louis blinked. "That's not possible. The road in was blocked until yesterday." Keith said nothing, then slowly lowered himself back down. When he hit the ground, he took off his gloves and said quietly, "This wasn't made by us, and if it wasn't made by us, we need to find out who the hell wired it." Louis looked back at the figure bound to the crossarm. Its head had tilted slightly in the night, but neither of them had moved it. Part 2. Louis hadn't told Haley everything. Back at the base, she'd been tracking the power draw across 3 different segments of the decommissioned grid. The phantom load had first appeared 22 miles south of the hill where they now stood, then again 14 miles north, and finally here, where the strange pole rose in the sky. The signal, as far as her maps could tell, had moved, and whatever it was broadcasting had become stronger overnight. At 6:15 a.m., Haley sent a second request for grid authorization to access legacy relay logs. The denial came back under a red stamp marked Department of Interior, emergency use only. That response was 2 levels above her clearance. She made a note of it and sat back from the desk. The voice had returned to her headset while she was reviewing the denial. At first, she assumed it was someone from Unit 12 keying in without announcing themselves. The cadence was wrong. The voice whispered with low, slow, precise consonants, as if learning to speak through static. It repeated a string of syllables, some English, some not, ending in what sounded like her name. Haley. Hey. She pulled off the headset and set it on the desk. The console lights flickered twice, then stabilized. Keith hadn't spoken in nearly half an hour. He sat on a collapsed stump beside the truck, his shoulders hunched, and his hands locked around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. The rain had stopped before sunrise, but a low fog now crept through the valley. It clung to the earth like something hiding just beneath the surface. Louis crouched beside the junction box they'd unearthed from the shallow trench. The box was old, its housing built from a polymer resin no longer used in modern installs. A pair of black cables fed directly into it, one from the pole, one disappearing downslope. Louis checked the leads again. The power was real, weak but live. Worse, there was data. Not grid diagnostic data, not anything from a smart meter. This signal pulsed irregularly, with small spikes of carrier modulation that seemed to change frequency when he turned his head. He looked back toward Keith. "You hear it now?" Keith didn't look up. "It's behind my teeth." Louis frowned. "What?" Keith opened his mouth slowly and closed it again. "It's not sound, it's pressure, like you said before. Only now it's inside." Louis stood and turned away, trying not to let the discomfort crawl up his spine. He tapped the mic on his lapel. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, come in." The return channel took several seconds to respond. Haley's voice came through faintly, like she was speaking from underwater. "Go ahead, Unit 12. Louis hesitated. "We've confirmed current in the buried junction. Load stable, but we've identified anomalous signal activity. Something is broadcasting. It's outside the commercial band, probably extra low frequency." Silence followed for a full 10 seconds. Then Haley's voice came back, clearer this time. "Understood. Are you picking up any encoded identifiers?" Louis checked his meter. No call sign or grid markers, just a rhythmic pulse and brief voice modulations. "We recorded a burst at 4.67 megahertz last night. It spoke." Haley didn't answer right away. "Haley?" Louis prompted. "Still here," she said. "Are you saying it addressed you directly?" Louis lowered the mic slightly. He thought about the way the voice had sounded, like it had been trying to remember how to speak. "Yes, it asked why we woke it." Haley took a breath, loud enough for the mic to catch. "That matches something I read this morning. I pulled a weather report from 76. There was a windstorm almost identical to this one. Same region, same anomaly. There's a handwritten note from an old operator that says, 'Thing in the relay asked for my name.'" Louis stared at the pole in the distance. The figure strapped to its arms hadn't moved, but the wires around its body had changed. You could tell. They now hung more like veins than restraints. Later that morning, Louis and Keith followed the buried cable line down the hillside to where it terminated near an ancient switching platform. The metal box had collapsed under its own rust, but one of the interior relays still blinked with an amber LED. "Impossible," Louis muttered. Keith didn't reply. His attention remained fixed on a set of animal tracks pressed into the mud just a few yards away. The prints were large, wide-set, and fresh. Too fresh. Whatever had passed through had done so after the rain had stopped. That meant it had been here recently. Louis traced the cables visually back toward the ridge. Something about their pattern seemed intentional. Not just utilitarian routing, but shaped, arranged. He took a few steps back and tilted his head. The line ran a suspiciously symmetrical branching formation, like a root system or a nervous system. He heard Keith mutter something behind him. "What was that?" Louis asked. Keith stared straight ahead. "It's not a transmission line anymore." Louis turned. "What do you mean?" Keith looked at him with sunken eyes. "It's a mouth." Haley scrolled through archived personnel files until she found the name she was looking for. The 1976 storm dispatcher had been a man named Elmer Crane. He retired under medical leave 2 months after reporting the untraceable frequency. His notes had been marked delusional by the follow-up review board. Phrases like self-aware code pattern and intentional infiltration of auditory cortex had been scrawled in the margins of his logs. One line had been highlighted and flagged for follow-up. The voice found the spaces between my thoughts. I don't know what's still mine. Haley's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her headset remained on the desk where she'd left it. Even now, she could hear something faint through the speakers, a kind of whispering sibilance that looped on a 5-second interval. The waveform showed no defined amplitude. It was noise, but ordered, like Morse code transmitted through molasses. She began transcribing it. The words, once isolated, didn't make sense. But after 10 minutes of work, she began to recognize patterns, repetitions, phrases that mirrored what Louis had described. And one word repeated more than any other: Crossarm. The sun never fully emerged that day. It remained a pale smudge behind low, shifting cloud layers. Keith had gone quiet again, choosing to stay near the truck while Louis continued documenting the power feed. Louis climbed the slope one more time and stood again before the pool. He watched the figure closely now. The wood forming its chest had cracked in the heat of the morning sun, revealing something darker beneath, organic in texture, threaded with black fibers that flexed subtly with the breeze. The wires that led from the body into the ground pulsed faintly, their sheathing twitching every few seconds as if under tension. Louis raised his mic. "Haley, I need a cross-reference on construction permits. Anything that predates the rural grid expansion of '58. Haley's voice returned quickly. "There's nothing on file, no records of poles, towers, or transmission projects in that region before the 1960s. That whole area was mapped as undeveloped until the hydro push in '61. Louis shook his head slowly. "Then what is this thing wired into?" She hesitated. "I think you're standing on it." He looked down at the ground. Haley continued. "There's an old legend out here, something passed around from settler journals, about a hill where the wind never blew right. The locals called it Signal Spine. Said the rocks would whisper when it rained." Louis bent down and touched the earth. The ground felt warm beneath the surface, unnaturally so. His palm vibrated slightly as if resting against an amplifier. "You still with me?" Haley asked. "Yeah," he said, "still here." He didn't mention that his hand now carried the tremor, even after he pulled it away. That night, Keith left camp. Louis woke to find his blanket gone, the truck door ajar, and the handheld radio still chirping with dead channel squelch. He followed Keith's tracks to the base of the pole. The moonlight showed just enough. Keith stood 20 feet up, balanced on a cross brace with his arm stretched toward the figure's chest. "Keith!" Louis shouted. Keith didn't respond. Louis climbed the base ladder quickly, boots slipping once on the rusted rungs. By the time he reached the top, Keith had turned to face him. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth hung open. "It's awake," he said. Louis grabbed his arm. "We need to get down." Keith nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on the crucified thing beside him. "It wants out," he whispered, "and we gave it everything it needs." The wind shifted, the cables around the figure rustled. Then the voice returned, this time not through radio, but through the air itself. It vibrated in the marrow of their bones. So close now. Back at dispatch, Haley turned off every electronic device in the room. Even powered down, she could still hear the signal. Part 3. By midday, Keith had stopped responding to his own name. Louis tried several times to reach him through the CB, but Keith never picked up the receiver. He sat near the base of the ancient pole, staring up at the figure lashed at the crossarm, as if it had started speaking again. When Louis approached, Keith spoke in quiet, rhythmic phrases that didn't seem directed at anyone in particular. The wire listens. The wire remembers. The wire carries thought. Louis crouched beside him and touched his shoulder. "Keith, I need you to focus. Something's coming through. We have to cut the feed." Keith blinked slowly, his lips moved. The words no longer matched any language Louis recognized. The figure overhead remained motionless, yet every few seconds, Louis felt a tightening sensation in the joints of his skull, like the bones behind his ears had begun to resonate with low-frequency vibration. He could no longer separate the sensation of hearing from thinking. Whatever the signal was, it had bypassed the airwaves. It was inside him now. Haley left the dispatch station and drove west, leaving behind the concrete bunker of her office and the flickering lights that had refused to stay off. She had hardwired a manual override into the breaker panel that morning, but every monitor in the room had powered back on anyway. The emergency generator had triggered itself twice. She had not touched it. As she followed the road into the Badlands, her radio cut in and out. Occasionally it transmitted dead static. Other times it hissed with fractured syllables and vocal fragments that matched neither her voice nor Louis'. She tried to stay focused on the landscape, but something had changed there too. The trees leaned away from the ridge, not bent by wind or snapped from the storm, but bowed as if repelled by something pressing outward from the hill. An empty transmission tower stood ahead, its arms bare, except for a tangle of dark cables that hadn't been there the week before. The cables hung in arcs that descended into the soil. The way they moved in the breeze reminded her of jellyfish. Haley took a deep breath and pressed harder on the gas pedal. The figure Louis had described was real. She knew it now. She was heading straight toward it. Louis followed the underground cable route toward the original trench, tracing it by signal strength. His field meter no longer showed data in numeric values. Instead, the screen displayed a waveform. He crested the ridge and found a second structure. This one lay collapsed in a shallow ravine, half submerged in runoff. The remnants of a crossarm jutted from the dirt at a broken angle, and a shape, similar to the one strapped to the main pole, protruded from the mud. Its surface had been warped by moisture and time, but Louis could still see the outline of a torso, the segmented lengths of arm-like branches, and the woven black cable that formed its ribs. He knelt and examined the figure closely. Unlike the upright construct, this one had been damaged. Splits in the wood revealed a hollow cavity. He reached for the sheathed cable that still clung to the wreckage and peeled back the insulation. Beneath it, he found flesh. It was not decayed. The texture resembled tree bark at first glance, but it flexed when touched. Beneath the outer layer, he saw muscle, gray, fibrous, and twitching in response to the air. Louis fell back and scrambled several feet away. Then the voice returned. "You wired me. You fed me thought." This time the words came from inside his own head. Louis stood slowly and looked down at the figure again. The buried frame had not been abandoned. It had grown into the earth. He realized then that there might be more of them. Keith stood beneath the pole again, arms outstretched toward the figure above. His lips moved in time with the pulse Louis had traced. The voice inside him had not stopped speaking. He no longer understood the words, but the meanings came through. He knew what the figure was now. It was not just a construct or a symbol. It was a prison. Something older than the tower had been bound there. Something not made for the limits of bone or wood. It had lived inside the wires since before there were poles to carry them. It had whispered along the copper in telegraph lines and coiled itself into vacuum tubes. It had waited. Now it had found an exit. The storm had cracked the ridge. The signal had reached the right frequency, and they had heard it. Haley reached the ridge of the clearing just after noon. The road had narrowed to a trail, and then the truck she'd borrowed from the base cleared the overgrowth. She stepped out slowly, carrying a radio scanner, a heavy-duty flashlight, and the last working analog mic from the dispatch center. The moment her boots touched the ground, the scanner in her hand spiked. The screen went white. She turned toward the pole. Louis stood beneath it, his back to her. His posture was rigid, his shoulders drawn upward. A cable trailed from his neck into the soil. Haley froze. "Louis," she called. He turned, and she saw the change immediately. His skin had grown pale, stretched thin across his face. His eyes were wide and glassy, pupils dilated beyond normal limits, several black cords now extended from his forearms and shoulders. They'd embedded themselves beneath the skin. Despite all of this, he smiled. "You made it," he said. Haley didn't speak. Louis stepped forward. "It's all true, everything we dismissed, everything we buried. It remembers." She raised the scanner, but the screen had gone dark. Louis reached toward her and said, "It doesn't want to hurt anymore. It just wants to be heard. It was screaming through empty wire for a century, and now we've given it a voice again." Haley took a step back. "What happened to Keith?" Louis looked toward the hill and nodded once. He helped complete the circuit. He understood what it meant. The figure on the pole shifted. Haley saw the motion clearly this time. The wooden chest cavity swelled outward and contracted again. A pulse moved through the cables, some of them now arced directly into the soil near Louis's feet. "Louis, listen to me," she said. "This thing isn't speaking, it's taking. It's transmitting commands. You're not yourself." He nodded slowly. "Neither are you. Not yet." Haley reached into her coat and pulled out an old field laptop she'd brought from the bunker. She opened it, connected the signal jammer node, and typed a series of commands. Louis's smile faltered. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Uploading noise," she said. "Same thing we used during the 05 relay hijacks. Overwhelm the carrier. Jam the message." Louis stepped toward her again, more quickly now. "You don't understand what you're silencing. It's not just noise, it's identity. It's been waiting for someone to listen." Haley finished typing and hit the command key. The jammer kicked in. All around them, the cables twitched violently. The figure on the crossarm shuddered, its frame expanding against the restraints. A burst of electromagnetic energy cracked the air, and the old pole groaned under the strain. Louis screamed. The cords attached to him convulsed and tore away. Smoke rose from the soil where the cables had fused. Louis dropped to the ground, convulsing. Haley rushed to him and knelt by his side. His body spasmed once more, then went still. She checked for a pulse. It was there, but faint. The pole collapsed just after the upload completed. The cables retracted, snapping away from the structure and burrowing back into the hillside. The figure lashed at the crossarm, convulsed once more, before splitting down the center. From inside spilled a mass of black threads and splinters, some of which writhed before falling still. Haley dragged Louis away from the wreckage as smoke curled into the sky. Behind them, the last of the static faded from the air. The signal had gone silent, or so she believed. 3 hours later, emergency crews arrived. Haley met them at the trailhead and led them to Louis, who remained unconscious but stable. She gave her statement, described the old pole, the strange wiring, and the unexplained power draw. When they reached the site, only broken lumber and scorched soil remained. No cables, no figure, no evidence of anything she described. The state investigator told her it must have been storm hallucinations. She didn't argue. That night, Haley sat alone in the dark, watching the stars through the windshield on her truck. The radio sat silent beside her, battery removed. She looked at the laptop in her lap. The upload had succeeded, but the waveform analysis had generated a new file. It was a sound clip, 3 seconds long. She clicked it. A voice, half human, half mechanical, whispered through the speakers. "Still here." Part 4. Haley did not sleep. She remained parked at the edge of the ridge with the windows cracked just wide enough to hear the wind. It had calmed since the collapse, but the silence didn't feel natural. No birds returned to the treetops. No insects clicked in the undergrowth. The world felt as though it had paused, waiting for permission to continue. Louie had stirred briefly at sundown, long enough to whisper her name and ask if it was gone. She didn't answer. It slipped back into unconsciousness a few moments later. Now, as the stars emerged one by one, she watched the tree line and kept the laptop on her knees. The waveform file still sat on the desktop. The audio clip, only 3 seconds long, had imprinted something into the system. She tried to delete it 3 times. Each time it returned. She clicked it again. The same voice, same distorted whisper. "Still here." The file size never changed, but each time she played it, the waveform grew more complex. It was learning. The next morning she returned to the wreckage. Louis remained with the medics at the trailhead. He was stable, but his nervous system had not fully recovered from the overload. They'd stabilized his vitals and administered sedatives. He spoke only in fragments. Most of the words used were technical. Bandwidths, circuit terms, and frequencies no longer in use. Haley followed the path alone. The clearing had changed again. The pole lay in splinters. The wooden beams that had once formed the crossarm had cracked lengthwise, exposing cores of blackened resin. Nothing remained of the figure that had been bound to it. The surrounding ground showed signs of combustion, but the soil had not burned, only melted as if fused with something synthetic. The cables that had once spread into the earth were gone. She approached the base and scanned the area again with her handheld. The meter remained still. Then she checked the analog compass. The needle spun in slow, clockwise circles. She stepped back and turned toward the trees. Somewhere beneath the surface, it still lived. That evening, she returned to the dispatch center. Her passcode still worked, but the keypad made a strange clicking sound when she entered the building, as if something inside the circuitry had been changed. She walked slowly past the empty desks and into the equipment room where the rack servers still hummed. The main monitor blinked with an alert. New device detected, external input, UHF band. She clicked to expand the log. A single entry repeated over 1,000 times. Handshake received. No timestamp, no origin address. She unplugged the tower and shut off the breaker. Then she crossed the room to the backup server and repeated the process. Still, the monitor stayed lit. She watched as the words reappeared on the screen unprompted. Not a voice, a structure. She typed a response. "What are you?" There was no delay. A framework for signal. "What do you want?" To be understood. Harley stared at the words for a long time. Then she typed again. "Why us?" The response came slowly this time. "You connected the lines. You opened the path. Your world runs on breadth and bandwidth. You can no longer tell them apart." Haley backed away from the terminal. Outside, the wind had returned. Louis woke that night with clarity. The pain in his limbs had dulled to a low ache. The nurses had dimmed the lights, but he recognized the pattern on the ceiling tile, the same dispatch facility he had visited during onboarding last year. Someone had moved him after the medics cleared him for transport. He sat up and groaned. Cords were gone. His arms remained scarred. Small ridges trailed down from each shoulder where the black insulation had fused into his skin. The nerves still felt raw, but functional. He rose carefully and found his boots by the cot. A note sat on the nearby desk. Gone to sever the backbone. If I'm not back by dawn, don't follow. It was signed H.D. Louis folded the note and slid it into his pocket. Then he followed anyway. Haley returned to the ravine where Louis had discovered the second structure. She brought only the essentials, an insulated cutter, a field jammer, and a gasoline canister. The collapsed frame had sunk deeper since they last saw it. Mud had overtaken most of the torso. Only a few fragments of black cable still protruded from the hillside. She dug, slowly, using her gloves to pull the top layer of soil aside. What she uncovered made her stop. Beneath the mud, the structure had changed. What had once looked like a carved torso now resembled a fetal shape. Its limbs curled inward. The cables no longer served as restraints. They had merged with the form itself, looping in and out of the surface. She placed the jammer at the edge of the pit and activated it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the signal returned. Her radio, even in the off position, began to hum. A low, undulating tone pulsed through the clearing. The shape of the earth twitched. From beneath the mud, a voice rose. Why disconnect what you built? Haley knelt and poured gasoline along the exposed portions of cable. Her hands shook. The voice changed, going deeper, more rhythmic. I lived in your wires long before your poles. I nested in copper. I learned your names. She struck a match and dropped it into the trench. The fire caught instantly. The shape convulsed once and split down the center. Something inside screamed, a high-pitched burst of modulation flooding the scanner and shattering the screen. Haley turned away and covered her ears, but the sound drilled behind her eyes. And then it stopped. The signal ended. The cable went still, and silence returned. Louis arrived just as the fire burned down to ash. He found Haley sitting at the edge of the ravine watching the smoke rise. "You came anyway," she said. He sat beside her. "You knew I would." Neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, Louis gestured toward the remains. "Do you think that's all of it?" Haley looked at him. "No," she said. "It was a node, a spoke in the wheel." Louis closed his eyes. "So the rest is still out there." She nodded. "Do we tell anyone?" he asked. Haley considered this for a moment. Would they believe us? Louis didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at his arms, where the scars still glowed faintly in the dark. 3 months later, a series of unexplained brownouts struck 5 counties across the state line. Emergency dispatchers reported brief instances of foreign language broadcasts on closed circuits. Several linemen working recovery claimed to have seen dark shapes inside junction boxes, but those reports were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations. One official cause remained undetermined. One of the engineers, reviewing spectrum data, noted a frequency spike centered at 4.67 megahertz. The file was forwarded. No one responded. That winter, Haley moved off-grid. She dismantled her home radio, converted her truck's ignition to analog, and pulled the breaker box out of her cabin. She burned her last computer behind the shed and never replaced it. Some nights she still heard it, the hum and the silence. It no longer spoke in words. It didn't need to, because now she understood the signal. It had been waiting for them to listen, and now that it had been heard, it had learned how to speak. Part 4. 4 years later, Louis stood beneath a new steel tower in a different state. The crew worked behind him, stringing fiber through fresh conduit and grounding the plates with modern composite clamps. This site had been logged as part of the rural expansion project, a final push to bring digital infrastructure to the deep corners of the country. He'd reviewed the schematics 3 times. The lines were clean, and the voltage was stable. The automation software behaved as expected. There were no false readouts, no anomalous draw. Still, he didn't trust it. Louis walked the perimeter alone with a handheld receiver clipped to his belt and a modified field tuner tuned to frequencies no one else monitored. The tool had been custom-built from legacy components he had salvaged after resigning from the grid authority. He kept it powered by hand crank. He trusted nothing that fed itself. The meter cracked once as he neared the anchor point of the 3rd tower. The spike barely registered, just a hiccup in the baseline hum, but it was there. He knelt beside the grounding rod and touched the soil. It was warm. He pressed the receiver to his ear, and he listened. Haley never returned to public service. She changed her name, moved west, and settled in a forgotten patch of land where the nearest power line terminated 2 miles short of her cabin. She lived by lantern light and heated her meals with wood. Her windows remained covered, and her mirrors were turned to face the wall. But even here, silence was not complete. Some nights, the shadows outside the cabin flickered without wind. And once, just once, she saw a strand of cable lying across her front steps. It had not been there the day before. She had swept the porch at dawn and had taken care to burn the refuse. But by twilight, the cord had returned, coiled loosely in the shape of a question mark. She picked it up with tongs and threw it in the fire. It didn't burn. Instead, it shrank into ash on its own, curling inward with a faint, twitching motion. That night, she left a note pinned to the cabin door. If anyone finds this, do not answer the frequency. Do not follow the signal. You will not know you are listening until it's too late. In a secure data center near Great Lakes, an IT technician working overnight reviewed anomaly reports from sensor arrays positioned along outdated relay corridors. The readings had been automatically flagged by a third-party diagnostic tool as possible artificial intelligence. Most of the entries were noise, false positives, weather anomalies, unshielded splices, but one entry stood apart. A clean burst of data had been logged for exactly 4.67 seconds. Its signal strength exceeded what was physically possible from any known repeater on the old grid. The packet contained no metadata, no origin, no timestamp, just binary. The technician ran a standard decode operation, then he ran a second, more thorough sweep, converting the output through 6 separate language filters. Each returned the same phrase, "I remember what I was." He called his supervisor. By the time she arrived, the file had vanished from the server. In an old steel utility cabinet just off Highway 6, a lineman named Carver spotted something he couldn't explain. He'd been called to repair a junction box that had shorted during a lightning strike. The location was rural and hadn't been updated since the mid-1990s. As he opened the cabinet, he noticed a bundle of black cable that didn't match the original schematic. It had no insulation stamp and no grounding sheath. The material felt strange, slick to the touch, yet dry. He followed the cable into the ground and traced it 20 feet to a nearby irrigation ditch. There, buried beneath a knob of weeds and a foot of gravel, he found a small concrete slab with a rusted bolt in its center. The cable fed directly into the bolt. Carver crouched down and tapped the bolt with his wrench. It rang, not like metal, but like glass under pressure. He returned to the cabinet and called dispatch. While waiting for a call back, he noticed something inside the panel. A word had been scratched into the metal with something sharp. It read, "Listening." Later that year, at a private conference hosted by an electrical safety consortium in Colorado Springs, Louis stood before a half-empty room and presented his findings. The presentation was unofficial. His credentials had expired. His case study was undocumented. The data he offered was anecdotal, unsupported by any published research. But the people in that room, many of them gray-haired men and women with 3 decades of field experience, did not laugh. Some nodded. Some avoided his eyes. One walked out early and left her badge behind. Louis described what had happened on the ridge. He outlined the burned poles, the wooden constructs, the frequency anomalies, and the behavioral changes he had observed in Keith. He detailed the patterns that had emerged across unconnected locations and shared waveforms recorded at the original site and during the years that followed. Most disturbing of all, he played the clip from the 4.67 megahertz burst he'd captured just weeks prior. A few attendees flinched. The rest remained still. When he finished, he asked for questions. No one spoke. One man at the back raised his hands, not to speak, but to show Louis a scar on his wrist. 3 thin lines, faint but unmistakably circular. Louis nodded once. He understood. A year passed, then another. In a small town near the edge of the Appalachians, a dispatcher named Renee began hearing things through the emergency band. The voices came between calls, soft and irregular at first, then rhythmic. Some of the other staff laughed it off, static, they said. Maybe bleed through from an old satellite junk. Maybe an old ham station bleeding through a repeater. But Renee noticed something they didn't. The voices always came after a storm, and the words they spoke never changed. Crossarm, complete. Haley's cabin eventually grew quiet again. The strand of cable never returned. The shadows outside ceased their flickering. She still avoided electronics, but she began to allow herself moments of stillness. On warm nights, she walked to the stream and listened to the water. The ground no longer hummed beneath her feet. She tried not to think about the others who might have heard the signal. She had left warning notes in decommissioning files. She had edited the field manuals to include non-standard interference protocols. She had rewritten the jammer software and uploaded it to public access servers disguised as driver updates. And still, she wasn't sure it would be enough. She had glimpsed the framework, and she knew how deep it went. 10 years to the day after the storm, Louis returned to the ridge. The land had healed, the path had overgrown, and the clearing where the pole had once stood was now littered with birch saplings. No sign of the crossarm remained, no metal, no wood. The earth no longer vibrated. His meter stayed silent. He crouched in the grass and pressed his hand to the ground. Nothing stirred. The network had gone dormant, but he didn't believe it was gone. He believed it had gone underground, not just physically, but metaphorically, into code, into fiber, into the ambient noise between connected machines. It would no longer need poles or constructs. It had found new structures, new carriers. It had waited before, and it would wait again. Louis stood and turned toward the trees. On his way back to the truck, his pocket radio clicked on without prompt, just once. A whisper threaded through the speaker. I never left. That was Crossarm by Vincent Noakes, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
I don't know what's worse, Otis. Waking something you can't see, or hearing it call you by name.
And if it's using your voice to do it, that's when you start unplugging everything.
If you've enjoyed tonight's journey through drowned schoolyards, haunted relay towers, stew pots that remember, and gardens fertilized with vengeance, then you're in luck. There's more waiting for you in the patrons area. Extended, ad-free episodes featuring bonus tales and exclusive horrors you won't hear anywhere else.
It's just $7.99 a month, or save big with the yearly plan, and it gives you full access to every story, every scream, without a single commercial break. You'll be supporting indie horror and making sure the doors to the dark stay open.
To join, just head to simplyscarypodcast.com and click the Patrons tab, or go straight to chillingtalesfordarknights.com to become a member. Come closer to the stories, if you dare.
From all of us here at Chilling Entertainment, thank you for your support.
If tonight's episode proved anything, it's that some things weren't meant to be born, and others refuse to stay dead. A school nurse keeping secrets, a power line humming with voices, a stew pot that whispers back, a garden full of justice, and a child with nothing but a wrench and a will to survive.
Tonight was a reminder that horror doesn't always wear masks. Sometimes it smiles at you from the marsh. It cooks dinner. It asks you to dig. Sometimes it hands you a tool and tells you to hope. And sometimes, that's the worst lie of all.
If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our parent channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, on YouTube, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new nightmare.
And if your craving for darkness runs deeper, come join me over on my other podcast, Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood, where the lake's always quiet, the fire's always low, and the things in the woods have names. There's an entire season's worth of scintillating tales waiting for you.
We'd love to hear what you've got under your skin tonight. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram and let us know. Was it the barrel-born children? The talking transmission tower? The stew with a soul? Or something else?
And of course, a deep, bone-rattling thanks to the wickedly talented authors who led us into tonight's haunted corners. Without them, well, we'd all sleep a lot easier.
But sleep is overrated. So next time you see something move in the garden, next time your radio tunes itself, or next time someone offers you hope out of nowhere,
just remember, some gifts were never meant for you, and some places weren't just quiet. They were warning you.
Sleep well, listeners.
If you can.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.